Welcome to Christian Statesman. I'm your host, Zach Wagner, and this is episode 92, Our Love of Internal Combustion. If you are of the baby boomer generation or somewhere thereabouts, you grew up in an era where the internal combustion engine has been brought into full maturity and technical perfection. You can walk into a local car dealership today and drive away in a vehicle making in excess of 700 horsepower. This was unheard of just a few short years ago. We now have vehicles of the 2- and 4-wheeled variety that can outperform racing machines of just a generation prior. I confess to an unadulterated love affair with internal combustion vehicles and admit to hosting a fair stable full of them over the years. If you are old enough, you remember the oil embargoes and fuel shortages of the early 70s. This forced our domestic auto industry into hard reverse as a giant V8 muscle car of the 60s that burned fuel like it was going out of style gave way to fuel-sipping imports from such previously little-known companies as Datsun. When Honda and Toyota emerged on the scene in the late 70s, their tiny jewel-like cars ran like a Swiss watch and burned only a quarter of the fuel of their American counterparts. From that day forward, things became much more competitive. When I was only 8, I looked forward to our monthly trip to the only nearby department store. I would take my meager allowance and buy a Hot Wheels car, seeking to emulate my grown-up neighbors who actually trolled around in their Ford Mustang GT, Plymouth Roadrunner, or Pontiac GTO. It was a heady time, and we were proud to be heavy metal driving Americans. But times change, and our lack of domestic oil production and dependence on OPEC countries for our fuel was a political dynamic that hamstrung us for decades. Our politicians responded by not investing immediately in domestic energy production, but by imposing greater mileage requirements and emission standards on our auto industries and imposing a paltry 55-mile-per-hour speed limit across the entire nation. Those standards, forged by political ideology, not engineering realities, often took years to resolve and overcome. In fact, it was only President Trump who addressed and created actual solutions to the issue of domestic oil harvesting and energy production. Unfortunately, Biden immediately reversed this trend for reasons unknown, for reasons that make absolutely no economic sense. These days, we are labeled antagonists if we choose to consume energy in an entertaining fashion. The historical consequence of such regulatory overreach was noticeable. In 1968, the typical Ford V8 engine made in excess of 350 horsepower. That same motor just 6 years later, burdened under newly imposed emissions and mileage regulations, managed only an anemic 150 horsepower. These regulations resulted in decades of bad and boring vehicles as engineers in the industry tried to catch up with the new federal impositions. The crazy 80s revived the industry somewhat, and with the onset of widely available computers and increasingly tiny and powerful computer chips, the internal combustion engine has undergone a renaissance in the last 20 years or so. Now, that same Ford engine is back in excess of 400 horsepower and, in some special performance applications, makes more than 600 horsepower. And even more noteworthy, that same motor can now record mileage figures over 20 miles per gallon. Its 1968 equivalent was lucky to get 6 to 8 miles per gallon. And even more interestingly, that same motor, properly maintained, puts out a minuscule amount of pollution into the atmosphere. Computers have so refined the internal combustion process as to render emissions almost non-existent. This is in stark contrast to the crudely carbureted machines of yesteryear, which would actually dribble unburnt fuel out of their tailpipe. A modern motor literally emits only a tiny fraction of emissions gases compared to motors just 30 years ago. There really is no coherent argument against enjoying widespread internal combustion in the future. Our cars, trucks, and motorcycles, properly maintained, will run a long time and pollute very little. Yet the movement is to trend us toward electric vehicles, an idea that looks great on paper, but is fraught with numerous infrastructure and raw materials problems, while pointing an accusatory finger at our dinosaur-burning friends. America was built on gasoline and cheap energy, and it is imprinted on some of our souls. Those 60s muscle cars spoke to me as they laid patches of rubber up and down our neighborhood's suburban roads. In the 70s, the sound of a Jaguar or Ferrari V-twin was akin to a Mozart symphony. A well-tuned American V8 is pure rock and roll today. One can even sense the personality of certain vehicles. I studied 2 years of mechanical engineering, imagining I would design and build them. The late 70s was unfortunately a bad time for the auto industry in America. When I trade in a vehicle, I feel like I'm saying goodbye to a close friend. I have literally wept when parting with certain special vehicles over the years. But today, faced with such inexplicable incidents as the Colonial Pipeline hack, skyrocketing government-imposed mileage standards, the exaggerated narrative of climate change, and a politically correct movement towards condemning all hydrocarbon-producing anything, I worry about those like me who've grown up developing a love and appreciation for internal combustion. If there is something better on the horizon, I'm all for it. Until then, give me the sound of a well-tuned motor, and I will find joy. Mimicking the old Beach Boy narrative, let's have fun, 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 and not allow our Washington daddies to take our T-birds away. Thank you for joining us today. Please subscribe, and as always, have a blessed day.